Welcome to the Social Movements Lab. My name is Michael Hardt. I'm in Seattle, Washington, and together with Sandro Mezzadra, who's in Bologna, Italy, I'm the co-host of this of the lab. Unfortunately, Sandro today couldn't be with us, so I'm the sole host of the lab. The purpose of the Social Movements Lab is to investigate contemporary social movements and the relationships among them. And so each encounter, each dialogue, we talk to scholar activists, people involved in contemporary struggles, so partly to learn what is going on, and then through our investigation, in some ways bringing together in each of these dialogues different contemporary struggles. It gives us, at least for us, for me and Sandro, and I hope sometimes for others, an idea of the landscape of contemporary movements, the existing connections among them, and the virtual potential connections among them too. Before beginning, I would like to, in today's event, we're discussing about independent unions and social protests in Russia. Before getting to that, I wanted to first of all thank Red May, who is sponsoring the event and taking care of all of the technical work. If you're interested in this kind of dialogue and you haven't seen any of the Red May events, I highly suggest that you go to the Red May YouTube channel. There has just concluded another May of full of Red May events of very interesting discussions, and I think you'll find interesting things there. I also wanted to thank our media partners, Dinamopress and EuroNomade in Italy, and the Franklin Humanities Institute at Duke University, where Sandro and I began this lab some years ago. So we have three interlocutors for the lab today, all of whom are members of an independent union, University Solidarity in Russia, and all of whom normally live in Moscow. Alexei Gusev, Ilya Guryanov, and Andrey Oleynikov. I hope I pronounce people's names well enough. I should say even before we begin that my knowledge of social protests and social movements and independent unions in Russia is unfortunately relatively slim, and I assume it is for many in the audience. So I really value this opportunity to get to learn more, and I'll try to also help clarify things if for outsiders like me things become unclear. So we have divided the beginning of our discussion, at least, into to four different topics that then I think we can evolve into a general discussion. As many of you know who've seen the lab before, one of the things that Sandro and I have tried to do consistently is to ask some similar introductory questions of each movement. And those questions are all about its connections, so that what we try to look at are what we call the genealogical connections of a movement. In other words, where did it come from? What are the precedents of other movements that are important for and led to it? What are the transversal connections, like other social movements, even in the same country, that have resonance and sometimes actually direct connections with it? And then what are the international connections, movements in other countries on similar topics, where again there are connections? And that has for us given us a kind of those three axes of connections have helped as a kind of orientation. So that's in a way that the way we'll proceed. But before doing that, Alexei has agreed to begin with helping to understand, first of all, what is University Solidarity and what its primary activities are. And so why don't we start with that, Alexei?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting us to speak at this forum. And the University Solidarity Russia, the full name of this union is Interregional Trade Union of Higher Education Employees University Solidarity, was born in April 2012, when representatives of several universities from 13 Russian regions hold its constituent conference in Moscow. 2012 was a period of an upsurge of social and political activism in Russia following mass protests against rigged parliamentary elections of 2011 and Vladimir Putin's return to the position of president. At that time, in big cities and towns of Russia, there were regular mass rallies with tens of thousands of participants who demanded democratic change. And university professors and school teachers, they also participated in these mass activities, and they formed their own science and education columns at these rallies. Then an idea appeared to form in a university organization, university association, and after intensive discussions, the initiative group decided that it should take a form of trade union and act as a part of the labor movement. All these discussions took place in 2012, and the union itself was created in 2013, in April. This decision to form not just a professional association, but specifically trade union was not an accident, because people who formed in 2012 the nucleus of this union, the initiative group, they previously had experience, most of them had previously experience of participating in the labor movement. They belonged to democratic left, and they cooperated with trade unions, or they made research of trade unions as scholars. And this idea to form a university trade union immediately got support from the Russian Association of Free Trade Unions, called the Confederation of Labor. In Russian abbreviation is KTR. And the unions which participated in this confederation, the workers' unions of private sector like transport workers, pilots, and others, they actively helped to form the University Solidarity. University Solidarity is called in Russian, in short, UNISO. But also at this time, there were creation of other so-called budget unions, the unions that united workers in public sphere, like the teachers union called the Teacher, and the union of medical staff called Action. So the labor solidarity really worked at that time, and Ilya Guryanov will tell more about the place of university solidarity in the labor movement in Russia in general. Thus, social and political upsurge provided favorable conditions for union building in the sphere of education. And let's ask ourselves, what were the main problems which drove workers of this sector to unite in the university solidarity? By the time of formation of our union, the Russian government began to realize the so-called optimization policy in the sphere of higher education. They made a so-called roadmap of development of higher education. This roadmap was published in 2012. And in practice, this so-called optimization meant austerity. It involved cuts of more than 40% of jobs in 5 years, radical increase of workloads for teachers, fusion of several universities into big entities that also meant cuts and the reduction of education programs. And of course, workers of education had to react to that. And the money saved from the so-called optimization had to go to finance such sectors as army, police, military-industrial complex, what constituted the main priorities of Putin's administration. That was the first problem. Another problem was low level of high school teachers' wages. Their wages were lower than the average wage of Russian workers. And the Minister of Education, at the time, a guy called Livanov, threw more paraffin into the flames by saying in the interview that those teachers who received less than 30,000 rubles, at that time it's about $600, were so-called low-grade specialists who had to blame only themselves for their miserable condition. And in fact, at that time, most teachers received less than 30,000 rubles, some of them about 13,000 rubles. So this minister's interview provoked indignation and showed to teachers that their bosses treat them with contempt, and they had to fight themselves for their wages and for their dignity. And from the beginning, the agenda of the University Solidarity concentrated on three principal problems: low pay, job cuts, and academic freedom. And in time, these problems in each of these spheres is escalated. And the union had to react by initiating large-scale campaigns, such as campaign for reduction of workloads, because in 2014 the ministry introduced a new standard that every university teacher had to work 900 hours a year. It's a big amount of work hours. So we demanded radical reduction of this workload. We also, yeah.
Okay, excuse me, just let me, I want to just clarify a few things so that I understand them. So are the members of University Solidarity, the university professors, also high school instructors members of University Solidarity?
Yes, all people who teach in universities, and also so-called scientific workers. We have this special category of workers there, but they also teach. They make research and they teach. So all people working in this sphere.
And roughly how many are there? How many members are part of it?
You see that we had about several hundred members. By now, I think it's about 300. And when we started our union, we had some groups in universities which actually were founders of the University Solidarity, which later disappeared. It's a fact. It's a sad fact, because this some people just lost their jobs because of pressure and so on. But the union was not defeated even after this upsurge of 2011 to 2013, when the University Solidarity was created, declined. Even after that, the union continued to exist. And I'm sorry, at the beginning I made a mistake. I said 2012 as a year of creation of the union. It's 2013, of course. 2012 was the creation of initiative group.
Right.
So I continue with other. Our campaign, which we have, was the campaign against short-term contracts and precarization, and we demanded that university teachers must have unlimited work contracts. And also we fought against the liquidation of self-government in universities, and so on. I can continue with our campaigns.
And all of that will be very interesting with the international connections we talk about later, because obviously other universities in other countries have had similar.
Yes, sure. And our University Solidarity Union, when it was created, published a declaration. And in this declaration, it said that it's based on three main principles. First, independence. Independence from bosses, from employers, from the state. This is our distinction from the so-called official unions, which continued from the Soviet time, and they are completely like an appendages to administration of universities and authorities. So independence. The second principle is democratism. And the third basic principle is internationalism. Because the trade union movement is internationalist in its essence. And we understood from the beginning that our problems in the higher education sphere are basically the same as problems in other countries, especially in countries which are similar to Russia. It's post-Soviet countries, and also countries with political regimes of authoritarian character, like Turkey, like Iran, where governments make pressure on civil society, on unions, and violate human rights, including labor rights. So University Solidarity from the beginning tried to establish contacts with unions in these countries, not only these countries, but first of all with these countries, and to participate in solidarity campaigns with teachers and workers in general in these countries. We cooperated with the Labor Start organization. Probably you know this. This is the International Center for Solidarity Campaigns. And we participated in such campaigns as, for instance, a campaign of solidarity with independent democratic unions in Kazakhstan. In 2016, the authorities of this Central Asian post-Soviet republic just liquidated the Confederation of Independent Unions of Kazakhstan. And in 2017, one of the leaders of this organization was sentenced to 2 years in jail. And of course, we tried to use all possible means, petitions, protests, letters, and so on, to support them. Another case is Belarus. And Belarus also had a very authoritarian government of Alexander Lukashenko, and we from 2017 continuously tried to support our brothers and comrades in the Belarusian Confederation of Democratic Trade Unions, especially in 2020. And now, when you know in Belarus there is there wasn't a great movement of protest, and unions participate in that, and unions suffer from that because some of them not only activists not only sagged but went to prison for that.
Right. Let's hold it there, Alexei, and because we can then return to these international connections a little bit later, because I thought that would be a good time to switch to Andrey, who's tasked with helping us understand the genealogical connections, both of university solidarity, Russia, and also the question of independent unions generally, which Alexei already mentioned. But so Andrey, where do you see? I mean, this might be a way of starting. And where do you see the most important historical precedents, or of either university solidarity or of the independent trade unions more generally? How would you help us situate that in the Russian context?
Thank you, Michael. I'll try to do that. First of all, I would like to give an affirmative answer to the question that I received before our conversation. I think we do have very important precedents in terms of the experience of self-organization in the form of independent union. Although this experience belongs to a rather distant past, to the time of the two Russian revolutions, revolution of 1905 and the revolution of 1917. Nevertheless, I believe that it still retains its significance. But before I talk about this, I think it would be appropriate to outline the immediate historical context in which our union appeared. That is, my talk on genealogical connections will consist of two temporal contextualizations. The first one is the closest to the time of the creation of our union, and the second one is more distant in time, but strategically more important, in my opinion. As for the time when our union was organized, Alexei has already mentioned some events, but I'll try to pay attention on different ones. Our union was organized in 2013 during the wave of the protest movement that began in Russia at the end of 2011. This wave was triggered by falsifications in the State Duma elections, which brought the majority seats in parliament to the pro-Putin party, the United Russia. And it was an expression of unwillingness to see Putin as president for the third time. This movement did not achieve its goals, but these were very fruitful years in terms of accumulating experience of self-organization and resistance to the regime. After almost 10 years now, in a situation of almost outright dictatorship that we are observing today, we understand how vegan was the time when people could still relatively freely hold processions, rallies, and pickets. Now, briefly about why we university professors and lecturers were involved in this movement. I will say right away that unlike the fundamental economic transformations that took place in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, no major reforms took place in the sphere of higher education. It remained approximately the same as it was under the Soviet regime, with the only difference that there was no more ideological pressure. But the university management system remained essentially the same. It remained authoritarian. This means that Russian universities have never been truly autonomous. Only the rector of the university, who was subordinate to the Ministry of Education, always had real power. Formally, according to the typical charter of the university, the rector was elected at the conference of all university staff. But in fact, this election was always dictated by the university administration and the Ministry of Education. Mm-hmm. In addition, it should be borne in mind that during the 1990s, Russian universities did not receive sufficient funding from the budget. Professor salaries were extremely low, always made university professors very dependent on the administration. The situation began to change in the 2000s. The government began to allocate more funds to universities and set them ambitious tasks, such as entering international rankings. New universities have appeared in Russia, which were not under the Soviet system, like the Russian State University for the Humanities in Moscow and the High School of Economics as well in Moscow. The administration of these universities was relatively liberal. They claimed that they were pursuing meritocratic goals, wishing that education and science in Russia would correspond to a high international standards. But by the beginnings of the 2010s, many initially loyal university employees had serious doubts that the administration, like the government of the country as a whole, was interested in the development of higher education and science. In this respect, the fate of the Russian State University for the Humanities, where I worked for the first 16 years of my career, is indicative, I think. Its founder was Yuri Afanasyev, a politician and historian, one of the leaders of Gorbachev's perestroika. in 2003, he agreed to the offer of Michael Khodorkovsky, the Russian oligarch who headed the Yukos company and invested large sums of money in the development of this university, to give up his place to Leonid Nevzlin, Khodorkovsky's closest aide. But soon after that, Khodorkovsky was convicted and thrown into jail. Nevzlin emigrated, and the university, after the Yukos funds were spent, stopped receiving financial assistance from the government, degraded, and became completely ordinary. Therefore, it's no coincidence, it seems to me, that the first primary organization of our union appeared at this university.
Right.
But I'm somewhat Russian things, because before it appeared, professors and lecturers of several other Moscow universities began to meet among themselves and to discuss the conditions of their work. This started happening at the end of 2011, when the mass rallies and processions began. These professors and lecturers organized their own community, which is called the Association of Higher Education Lecturers, and it originally formed the core of the University Solidarity Union. And now,
let me interrupt you, Andrey, just for a second, because I wanted to clarify two things that and they're very different. I don't know if we should do them at the same time, but one is a question, seeing more things more generally. My impression has always been from the Soviet times and also now in Russia that there has been an extraordinarily high level of education of the Russian population, both in high schools and in universities, especially in science, technology, and similar topics. And I certainly understand the difficulties that are both from the lack of autonomy of the universities that you're saying, and then the budget restraints and austerity, the precaritization. But my impression from the outside, this is why I wanted you to correct me if I'm wrong, is that high level of general education has continued in Russia in the post-Soviet period, and I imagine, or I think, is part of a national pride. Am I correct in that? That maybe both points about this. The wide and high level of educational achievement in both the Soviet and Russian periods, and then also perhaps about and why I bring up the national pride in that is because I assume that gives a certain amount of leverage, public leverage, to university and high school professors, because there's a certain prestige of this. Okay, so let me put that on one side. Hold that, because the other question I wanted to ask, and it's both from what you had said, Andrey, and something that Alexei had said earlier that I thought is worth clarifying for everyone. I think I understand it, but I just thought it's worth writing a little more, which is the nature of unions and the nature also of the university unions that are tied to the government and that tradition of unions. So I guess I just wanted to emphasize what the dominant situation is of these not independent unions, and hence the decision to create an independent union and insist on autonomy, like Alexei had said. That's just something about the context which would be helpful, I think, for people outside of the country. Okay, sorry to give you two very difficult big topics.
Michael, if you are not against, I would try to end my story of genealogical connections, and after that I will switch to the question you you asked me recently. So yes, but yes, you are right, and that the prestige of high education and education in general was high in the Soviet Union, and it is still to be high. But you know, when I said that the management of the higher education was the same like it was in the Soviet Union. I just wanted to stress that to point out that our system of education still is very, how to put it, insensitive to challenges from outside, from the society. So let me end my
sure.
my talk. Yes. So now I turn to the story. I turn to the story of the important historical precedents of our union. I will talk about the events of the early 20th century. At the very beginning of the 20th century, Russia was an absolute monarchy. But Russian society demanded changes, and this demand became especially strong in 1905, when Russia was waging an unsuccessful war with Japan. This first Russian Revolution began. The first Russian Revolution began in which the Russian intelligentsia played a very noticeable role. In the course of these events, the first union of university professors and lecturers arose in the history of Russia, which was called the Academic Union. And it was a very successful organization. About 70% of all university professors and lecturers have become members of this union. They managed to achieve an important change in the procedure for approving the rector of the university. Prior to this, the rector was appointed by the Ministry of Education. The Academic Union was able to ensure the Academic Union considered itself a social political organization. Its members clearly understood that it was impossible to improve education in the country without changes in the political system. They not only sought to improve the working conditions of their colleagues or university autonomy. Unfortunately, the activities of this association did not last long and actually ended after Tsar Nicholas II issued the famous manifesto, which turned Russia into constitutional monarchy and introduced parliament and liberal freedoms. And the next important stage in the history of self-organizing communities of university professors falls on the events that followed the October 1917 revolution. Here we are dealing with associations that did not try to solve such large-scale tasks as the Academic Union of 1905. These associations arose due to the resistance that Russian academic community showed to the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were not at all interested in preserving the elements of autonomy that Russian university previously possessed, nor were they going to guarantee academic freedom. They subordinated all universities to the People's Commissariat of Education, which now appointed rectors. And here they met resistance from professors and lecturers. In April 1921, a strike of professors and teachers, lecturers of the Moscow Higher Technical School took place, which thus protested against the decision to dismiss the elected rector and appoint a Bolshevik protege in his place. And they achieved the cancellation of this decision. During these events, an association arose in Moscow, which became known as the Moscow Union of Scientists. And it became the first professional association which then set itself approximately the same goals that are now guided by our university solidarity. That is, they fought for university autonomy and academic freedom. Unfortunately, they could not resist the Bolsheviks for long. They angered Lenin greatly after they staged another successful strike in early 1922 and secured wage increases for university staff. In August 1922, members of this organization were arrested and expelled from the country under the threat of execution. This is how the story of self-organization of communities in Russia University ended, sadly. And now I will come back to our days. Again, our professional union with this University Solidarity was conceived as an alternative to the professional union that the Bolsheviks created when they fought the latest manifestations of self-organization in Russia. As you know, the Soviet regime created unions under its control in order to paralyze the grassroots labor and professional union movements. The professional unions that arose during the Soviet era and continue to exist today are essentially social services that distribute modest benefits such as New Year's gifts for children and vouchers to sanatoriums. Therefore, from the very beginning, we understood that the main task of our union should be to participate in the governance of our universities. We do not strive only to improve the working conditions of our colleagues and to raise salaries which remain very low. I think that today our tasks remain about the same as they were for our predecessors in 1905. We continue to strive to democratize higher education governance in Russia. That is, in our activities, we combine the features of the classic trade union and the social and political organization, which was the academic union of 1905. So far about the genealogical roots of our union.
Right.
Thank you.
No, that's great. And it's super interesting that the deep historical memory still functions and feels alive. Well, I mean, back to 1905 and 1921, the whole that still functions as an example seems really useful. Given our time, I think we should move to Ilya and the transversal connections. And by transversal connections here, we mean connections with other movements in the same space, whether those connections are explicit or potential. I guess that's true. So Ilya, why don't you start? And I should of course apologize beforehand because my tendency is always to interrupt and clarify or ask questions that are part of it, but I'm sure that'll be fine. Go ahead, Ilya.
It's okay, Michael. It's okay. It's okay. Greetings from Yeysk, a beautiful city on the shores of the Sea of Azov. Greetings to all interesting in trade union movement in Russia, independent trade union movement. And let me start from a little bit theoretic point that our union is weak. And our unionist groups in different universities are weak. And we are weak in two ways. We are weak in numbers, and we are weak in our capacity or ability to organize our colleagues in different universities for protection for protecting their rights, for protecting each other. And to understand this situation, we have to discuss, well, it's important to explain our transversal connections because we have several independent trade unions in Russia. Maybe the most important independent union is the union of the employees of Russian Academy of Science. It doesn't participate in any union network. But to the biggest networks, if you can see, I prepare it a little bit in old-fashioned manner because I'm far from my improvised home office. So you could see here some old-fashioned scheme. So we have two big network for unions. One of them called Federation of Independent Trade Unions of Russia. In Russian, it is called FNPR, its abbreviation, and it has two main features. First of all, it has nearly all infrastructure of USSR's unions. The brief characteristic of USSR's unions gave my dear colleague excuse me, Andrey Oleynikov. It's true. It wasn't a true union. That is why I use quotes. It's quasi unions, and also in the same network are so-called yellow unions. If you are interested what yellow unions means, what is about, I could explain it later if it's not clear. So the other network called here Confederation of Labor of Russia. In my opinion, it has two main parts or two main bushes. Two main branches. First of all, unions in a private sector, and it's not our case. It's not the case of University Solidarity because of the structure, because of the system of higher education in Russia. But also there are several problems. I mean, the problem of quasi-hidden state-owned companies like Gazprom. Probably Gazprom is the most famous company all over the world, Russian company, I mean, transnational company, generally speaking. And also the corruption is a problem. It is very important, it is very interesting, and we have some events with unions participating in Confederation of Labor of Russia, discussing some common problems, and it is a kind of direct connection, surely. But the situation we have in our government sector is specific, because in private sector, well, if it is not a company like Gazprom, if it is private company, enterprise, but not very interesting for Russian government and not very interesting for instance, people having a huge experience in police structures, in army. These kind of people usually participate in management of these companies from private sector. But if this company do not a subject of interest of Russian government, and they have a kind of cleavage with their employees, with their workers, they could decide their problems in the manner applying to the idea of money, because if this kind of enterprise would have more money, they could pay more to the employees, and so on and so on. But it's not all the cases, really, because it's not a clearly a private sector in economic sense, and government could influence to all spheres in private sectors of economy. The other situation here in unions in government sector, and we have, as Alexei Gusev already said, three very, very friendly to our University Solidarity unions, the Union of Health Workers. I would like to say physicians, but in fact it is health workers, because, for instance, drivers of ambulances also participate in this union. So health workers union, called Action or Действие in Russian, school teachers union called Teacher or Учитель, and our academic employees union called University Solidarity or Unisol in well, common abbreviation. It is a common abbreviation for our union. So that is a scheme of formal relation, and well, the reason why we do not have relations with some unions from this part of this sheet. So the biggest Russian union for academic employers called, give me a second, called Trade Union of Education and Science Employees of the Russian Federation. Actually, it is a part of this very old infrastructure of USSR's unions. And in our community, we call it Union for Flowers and Candy for March 8. So this union do not really participate in protection of employees' rights. They do not try to work with administrations of universities and so on. But in the case of some, well, problems, they could imitate an activity of real union. That is why it is very important to know who they are really.
So, Ilya, let me stop you for a minute. That seems to me super clear and important. The distinction between the two types of unions, and even with the university. I wanted to focus on just one part of your chart, which was super helpful, which is the part with the connections among University Solidarity, the school teachers, which makes many, but also the health workers. So I was wondering if you could describe on what basis is there connections among them. I mean, I understand that they're all independent unions, so they're all insisting on their autonomy from state control, also from the state unions. Is it also, now I'm thinking some things that Alexei said earlier, is also the theme of democratization something that links them? You know, so it seems to me that healthcare workers and university professors, I can see some connections, but I'd like to see a little bit more. What do you consider the primary concepts or political choices that unite them, and maybe even the kinds of practices, if certain practices unite them? Yeah, so could you just think a little bit more, help me understand a little bit more about that connection, especially with the health workers? What is it that can constitute a connection? I'm not sure if I'm asking it quite right.
Okay, I see a question. I get it. So both variants are true, but for different parts of our union. For instance, for our union activists, political agenda is very important in our attempt to support such unions as action. We see a global context, and we try to explain to our colleagues that we have no a kind of isolated problems in health sphere and in educational sphere. But this kind of thinking is a kind of destiny for union activists. For a major part of our union, probably it's not so important. It's very important, for instance, for those who has an experience of fighting for democratic freedoms, as Andrey Oleynikov said, because it's a kind of nuclear of our union. But it's not very important for most parts of our union, interesting in some concrete practices for instance, how to raise our salaries, how to inform colleagues in our sphere about our existence, because I am pretty sure that lots of academic employers even do not know about university solidarity, and it is a weakness, a kind of disadvantage of our union. But on the other hand, it is probably an opportunity for us, because until government and employers do not know that we are a real power for academic employers in Russia, we could work on trying to rise our numbers and trying to organize our groups in different universities better, so we could mobilize our colleagues during companies devoted to different problems in different universities. So
well, I was just thinking that I mean that's super helpful, and that makes sense. I wanted to ask, and this could be also for Alexei or Andrey too, or Ilya, and this is, maybe you'll see some of my lack of knowledge in this question. I mean, on the one hand, maybe an easy question would be the relationship between university solidarity and students, or student movements, or student organizations. But I'm also curious if there are any explicit or resonance with social movements that are not independent unions. You know, social movements for democratization, or social movements. I mean, in other contexts, one might see feminist movements, a relationship with feminist movements, or LGBTQ movements, or other. And so I was just thinking that this kind of question could help people get some idea of the landscape of different kinds of contestation, even if there is an explicit relationship to it. Ilya, what do you?
Yeah, I could answer this question briefly. Nowadays in Russia, we live in a damaged landscape of all types of organization. So surely our union has lots of connection with different student groups, feminist groups, and other types of groups for with independent students media, such as Doxa. They are very brave guys doing a lot for student community in Russia. But because of this generally damaged landscape for all formalized movements in Russia, it is better for students not to have structured organization. It's better to all types of movements with having this democratic agenda in their basis, to have a kind of
Like an
dissolved horizontal organization, yes, because if they would be a formal organization, they could have this terrible state of so-called foreign agent, and it is very bad for all people participating in the activities. We have this problem nowadays with student independent media Doxa, because their editors nowadays sitting at home. It is a kind of punishment for their activity, for their information for students, that they could participate in meetings, and universities should not dismiss them for this participation.
So that the current forms of repression make it difficult to have structured organizations, and that instead informal organizations, you said also horizontal, are more effective ways of avoiding the repression. and still being. We lost Ilya temporarily, which actually forces us. Alexei, go ahead, Alexei.
Yes, I mentioned the declaration of the University Solidarity, which was adopted at its constituent conference in 2013, and it said very important thing that on one hand, University Solidarity is a classical union, independent union. On the other hand, we don't want to limit ourselves only to this trade union agenda. We see our mission as more broad one. And this is close to the model which Andrey Oleynikov described, the model of the professional political unions of the early 20th century. And we, in this declaration, said that we fought not only for defending our wages and the conditions of labor and so on, but we fought for change of the policy, of the state policy towards the education sphere, but not only this sphere. We stand for a democratization of the whole system, including the system of education. We understand that we can't solve our problems only on the level of university, our university, that university, this university. We should obtain the general change. And we can't obtain the change of the situation, for instance, in the financing of public sphere, without political change. So we have this agenda which we share with all other democratic movements and protest movements, and University Solidarity is an integral part of this movement, broad movement. And University Solidarity, as Ilya and Andrey said, quite a small organization, several hundred people, but these people are non-conformist people. These people, many of whom participate not only in trade union activities, but also in some other activities, feminist and democratic and so on and so forth. So we are inside this broader social movement in Russia.
Right, that's interesting. Andrey, it seems that you were about to add something when Alexei was speaking. Oh, Oley, you're muted still. There you go. Yeah.
I can only say that I completely share the view of my comrades Alexei and Ilya. Yes, Ilya several times stressed that we are weak. As a union, we are still weak. And it is, of course, true. But our contemporary situation doesn't allow ourselves to pretend to solve some big, big questions, big tasks. But we exist for almost 10 years, and it means that we don't refuse from our initial goals that we proclaimed when the university was established. So what is left for us is to hope that situation will be changed, and we can put our strength, our abilities to resolve some more concrete tasks. But now we, I think it's important that we see some mutual tasks and still trying to resolve them.
Right. It does sound like, well, for one thing, when Alexei was speaking about the declaration and the being more than a union, in some ways being it's something like that. One might think of university solidarity in that respect as in this tradition of social movement unionism, or some sort of intersection between a union and a social movement, having not just what we call it corporatist aims, toward the specific regime, but much broader ones. And then also when all three of you were talking about the larger landscape of contestation in Russia, it seems to me that I'm understanding that different demands for democratization, and then also when you said, Alexei, non-conformism, refusal of the current regime, whether one calls it authoritarian or not. I'm trying to think what is it that holds together this varied landscape of different forms of protest within the unions and without. Am I right that democratization is a key way of thinking among those activists of what links?
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
There was in the early 20th century the phrase which was used by activists of the labor movement and social democratic movement that we can't achieve anything without political freedom, because political freedom is like a fresh air for labor. So this is the basic precondition without which any going forward is impossible.
Right. In fact, you said the three, or in the declaration, and I remember this from the declaration, that independence or autonomy, democracy, and internationalism are the three things. One of the things, and go ahead, Ilya, then I'll bring things to a conclusion. Ilya, go ahead.
Well, I'm totally agree with Alexei, but I should say that lots of our colleagues in different universities, especially in regional universities, are afraid of politics, of Russian politics, and they're tired from Russian politics, and they do not believe in the possibility to change something in political life during this political regime based on the power of so-called forced departments of Russian governments, I could even say of Russian governmentality, because these forced departments, they are in heads of lots of Russian officials in different levels, in different universities. So in our unions, for this category of colleagues, we have the possibility of working especially with their labor rights. We have this possibility. If you do not interested in politics, if you do not want to have any references with the politics, it's a little bit strange for modern independent Russian trade unions. But we also have this possibility. You could work inside your university and trying to organize a good group of unionists. It could be a hidden group. Until the moment you could say that, well, there are thousands or hundreds or dozens of us, so please guarantee us our labor rights. And it is also a very important direction of union organizing. I always, in my university, Higher School of Economics, explain to colleagues saying that, well, University Solidarity, it's a kind of political party, but with not formal participation in elections and so on. I say, well, not. We have a political agenda because our university problems could not be solved without global changes. Alexei Gusev, absolutely right. I'm completely agree with him. But if you're maybe afraid, maybe tired from all these political processes, this domination of government in all sphere of political life in Russia, so you could organize seminars devoted to labor rights here in Higher School of Economics. You could tell your colleagues here in Higher School of Economics about trade union. You shouldn't have a kind of sign that you're from trade union. You could be a hidden member. To time, we would be strong enough to protect at least a group of our members in one university. And it is also a very important, in my opinion, a very important direction of our community and union organizing.
Right.
Thank
Now,
you.
that makes sense, and one can work on two levels at one time. You know, with some people working in a very local way. And
Surely.
And that makes sense.
That is my position. I do not know if Alexei and Andrey totally agree with me, but that is my position and position of my unit of in Higher School of Economics.
You know, I think one of the things that strikes me, you know, thinking about the discussion the last hour is how present a long history is for you. I mean, the different references we've had to 1905 to other early 20th century things. I find it kind of fascinating that the long history has a kind of the past doesn't seem past, maybe put it that way, and that the early 20th century can be a continuing inspiration. You know, that 1905 could be a continuing inspiration. I think that's really wonderful. You know, I generally with the lab, we try to keep to the discipline of a 1 hour conversation. And I think that's great. We don't, as this, and this often happens, that in an hour, we really just open problems that there would be many, that would take much longer to discuss. But I feel like I've learned a lot, and I'm grateful for that. And I've found it a really interesting discussion. So I think we should close it there. Thanks again. Luckily, on our stream now, we have everyone's full name. So, but thank you to Alexei, Andrey, Ilya, for a lovely discussion. And we'll have to think about another occasion in the future to continue this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.